Welcome back, everyone, for the 4th episode of my campaign review and tier list series. I'm always amazed and grateful by the amount of positive feedback I get for these videos, so I'm doing what I can to keep them coming. For those who are new or need a recap, this is the series where I review each of AoE2 DE's official campaigns, breaking each down scenario by scenario, evaluating its strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately placing it on the tier list. Each episode covers 3 campaigns, going in chronological order from Alaric all the way through Bayanong. This is, of course, the 4th episode of the series, meaning that we have already completed 9 campaigns so far. Today, we're going to add another 3 to the list with Saladin, Prithviraj, and Genghis Khan. As always, before I begin, I do just want to say that these videos really take a ton of time and energy to make, so if you are hyped for the campaigns today, please do take the opportunity to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to watch more AoE2 content. With our monthly sellout completed, let's begin by journeying to the Holy Land to finish up the Third Crusade. We briefly got to see him at the end of the last episode, but of course, the first campaign of the day will be another Age of Kings classic, Kingdom of Heaven. Saladin. This is naturally going to be AoE2's campaign for the Saracen civilization, lasting from 1163 to 1191. This time frame mostly overlaps with Barbarossa, and indeed it will provide us with the Islamic perspective of the events leading up to the Third Crusade. So since the Age of Kings and Age of Conquerors campaigns were made around 20 years ago, the devs of the definitive version of the game made numerous small changes throughout all of the originals. I admittedly forgot to mention it in the last episode, but the DE version of El Cid was done by Bassi, and the DE version of Barbarossa was done by Freeman 1302. Better late than never, right? Anyway, getting back to Saladin, the remastered version of this campaign was also done by Bassi. Moving on to the difficulty of the campaign, the devs actually deemed Saladin to be the only original AoK or AoC campaign to be worthy of a 2-sword rating. Personally, in no particular order, I would say that Saladin, Barbarossa, and Montezuma are the most challenging of the original campaigns, so I can certainly see why Saladin gets bumped up to the medium difficulty designation. Now, with all of that intro stuff out of the way, just like always, we're going to break down the Saladin campaign scenario by scenario. First up is An Arabian Night, which covers the expansion of Saladin's power in Egypt, as well as his initial clashes with the European Crusaders. A very simple A to B scenario, the mission has you begin with a fairly sizable army to the north of the map on the west side of the Nile River, which bisects the map north to south. You are almost immediately attacked by the appropriately named West Franks, but their tiny force can be defeated with ease. Your objective at first appears to be to defeat the Franks west of Cairo. However, once you reach the river crossing to the south of the map, the foolish Egyptian caliph will side with the Franks against you. To remind the Egyptians of your power, you must cross the Nile into Cairo and bring at least 1 military unit to the mosque in the north of the city. Once you do this, the Egyptians will realize their mistake, give you some reinforcements, and implore you to defeat the Franks east of Cairo. The East Franks have a small camp guarded by a moderately large army, but destroying their TC will win you the scenario. So although An Arabian Night does a nice job of setting up the conflict between the Saracens and the Crusaders, it's still a really basic scenario. Yes, I do normally give campaigns a pass when it comes to having a very basic intro mission, but An Arabian Night is really just too simple for my taste. The one side quest is that you can destroy the West Frank blacksmith to get chain barding armor, but beyond that, the entire level can be completed by just patrolling your army across the map. Unfortunately, a bit of a weak start in my opinion. Despite a bit of a weak intro, things really do pick up in the Saladin campaign's second scenario, Lord of Arabia. Here you are introduced to the renegade Frankish knight Reynald de Chatillon, who is violating a treaty between Saladin and the Crusaders by attacking trade caravans throughout Arabia. You begin with a small coastal village to the center of the map, and your objective is to defeat Reynald's forces while protecting your defenseless allies of Aqaba and Medina. The Frankish army is actually split into 3 factions: Reynald's bandits, raiders, and pirates. Firstly, the bandits only command some scattered military units and do not actually need to be defeated to win the scenario. Instead, your main adversaries are the raiders, who control a clifftop fortress to the northeast of the map, and the pirates, who maintain a large base in Egypt across the Red Sea. As mentioned, you will need to protect your allies, the walled port of Aqaba and the open city of Medina. Although neither train an army, they will occasionally tribute you gold if you can protect their trade units. Interestingly, Lord of Arabia is one of the very few build and destroy scenarios in all of the campaigns that pits you against an enemy that can advance to an age that you cannot. In this case, despite starting in feudal, Reynald's pirates will eventually advance all the way to the Imperial Age, whereas you are restricted to the Castle Age. This does add an interesting challenge to the scenario, as it means you really need to leverage the strength of the Saracen camels and navy. Lastly, I do have to mention that Lord of Arabia contains the most memorable line in the entire campaign with the classic, "Help! Crusaders are attacking our trade routes!" Next up in Saladin is the Horns of Hattin, where Saladin's armies pounce on the weary Crusader armies in the middle of the desert. To win, you must capture the Crusaders' precious relic in order to completely demoralize them. As you are in the middle of the desert, this level notably prevents you from building any stone defenses and restricts you to a pop limit of 75. Regardless, Saladin does initially command the most forces, with a large camp to the north and a smaller one to the south. The map is quite small, so between your bases are clustered the various Crusader factions. The Britons are to the east on the shore of Lake Tiberias, Jerusalem is to the south, and the two Teutonic orders of the Knights Templar and Hospitallers hold a combined camp to the far west. Indeed, the two Knight Orders will be your most powerful enemies, as both start in the Castle Age, and the Hospitallers are the ones who control the piece of the True Cross relic. Lastly, Reynauld himself will eventually join the Jerusalem Crusaders, so you can finally deal the Rogue Knight some well-earned justice. So I'd say that the Horns of Hattin is a pretty solid scenario in general, if not a bit on the easy side. You start with plenty of resources and 2 town centers, so it's not all that difficult to rocket ahead of all of your enemies economically. Still, you are in a 4v1 and cannot rely on walls, towers, or castles to defend yourself. I do have to say that I really like the flavor of having your goal be to not just defeat, but also to demoralize the thirst-crazed Crusaders by taking their holy relic. Also, apparently the Crusaders are so delirious from dehydration that they don't notice that they are literally right next to a giant freshwater lake. Anyway, perhaps the Horns of Hattin is a bit of a mid-campaign break scenario, but it does do a lot to advance the narrative, and a 6th-level campaign does have the space for a smaller scale skirmish. The Saladin campaign's 4th scenario takes us to a familiar location in the Siege of Jerusalem. And yes, the Jerusalem we find here is almost exactly the same as the one in The Emperor Sleeping. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, Jerusalem is still in the hands of the Crusaders, and their main force is supplemented by the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. Your task for this scenario is to conquer the city by destroying its 5 towers. Saladin is intent on making himself not appear as another bloodthirsty conqueror, so you cannot destroy any of the city's monasteries or the Dome of the Rock. Jerusalem itself is large and well defended, and although you arrive at the northeast of the map with a fairly sizable army, you will still need to buy time to get your war machine up and running. Thankfully, most of your enemies' economies lay outside the city walls, and are therefore ripe for raiding. Beyond this, the scenario is a very straightforward destroy targets mission. So, the Siege of Jerusalem is another flavorful scenario, and the first time in the campaign where you are pitted against a massive city. Jerusalem starts out fairly weak, but if you are not diligent in raiding them, they can grow to be quite a deadly enemy. The 2 Knight Orders are stuck in the Castle Age, but can still be a thorn in your side if not dealt with. Yes, this level is pretty straightforward, but I like the fact that it encourages you to actually siege the city by raiding the enemy economy outside the city walls to prevent them from having the resources to train a big army. Lastly, there are some memorable Easter eggs with the Archers of the Eyes and the Master of the Templar in his Star Wars reference. Not the craziest scenario in the world, but the Siege of Jerusalem is still a pretty decent level in its own right. The penultimate Saladin scenario has you taking the fight to the Crusaders in Jihad. At first glance, this is a very straightforward build and destroy mission, with your objective simply being to defeat 2 of your 3 main enemies, Tiberias, Tyre, and Ascalon. However, this level does have a few tricks up its sleeve. You begin with a small but fortified coastal town in the center of the map, possessing a few villagers and no army. Your only ally here is the defenseless town of Hebron to the northeast of the map, which will do little more than provide you with a market with which to trade. The map is actually quite large, with the Mediterranean dominating the west, so fishing ships are an excellent investment if you can protect them. Now for your enemies. Tyre controls an incredibly well-fortified island to the north of the map, and will use its large navy to provide cover for its landings of cataphracts and bombards. Tiberias lies to the far east of the map, near its namesake lake. They are initially your weakest opponent as they only begin in the Castle Age, but they will eventually get to a post-imp army of Persian cavalry. Ascalon is the final Crusader city, with a heavily defended fortress to the far south of the map. They will not go on the offensive, but rather sit back and try and build a wonder. Lastly, to keep you on the back foot, the Tripoli Guard will attack you with a moderately large army a short way into the scenario. Alright, so like I said, there is actually quite a lot going on with this mission. I'm actually a big fan of it. Each of your 3 main enemies are quite different from one another and require unique approaches when it comes to defeating them. Tyre requires you to go for a large navy, Tiberias and its 3 castles necessitate a large land army, and Ascalon exists to put you on the clock. Although not comparable in difficulty to the next scenario, I still vividly remember struggling with this one a lot as a kid. I really do appreciate the variety of this scenario, as it allows you to use both the land and sea strengths of the Saracens. My only complaint is that the 100 pop limit is kinda low, and this feels like a mission that should be a little bit more expansive. Finally, I should mention that the side quest where you can ally with Tiberius used to be broken in the original game, but it does now work in DE. Oh boy, now we come to the biggest final boss battle in all of Age of Kings, the Lion and the Demon. The Third Crusade has finally been launched, and Saladin's forces find themselves trapped in the coastal city of Acre. Your objective here is nominally to build and defend a wonder, but many players, including myself, find it a bit easier to actually just go out and defeat all of your enemies. Either way works. Regardless, you do begin with control of Acre, a massive Imperial Age city on a peninsula to the center of the map. However, the Crusaders have set up their camps across the entire northeast of the map, forcing you to fight your way to additional resources. The Crusaders are split amongst many factions, and from north to east, their camps are arrayed as follows. The Genoese, who will exclusively attack you from the water, then there are the Franks, who will aggressively pursue you with cavalry and gunpowder, then there are the Knights Templar, who train Teutonic Knights and Paladins, Richard the Lionheart, who commands the trebuchets, God's own sling, and bad neighbor to accompany his longbowmen, and then finally the Crusaders from Jerusalem, who will make mostly light cav and siege. As grim as things may look, you are not completely alone. The Shah of Persia will eventually send you reinforcements in the form of 5 fully upgraded elite war elephants. So, the Lion and the Demon is considered by many to be the single most difficult mission in all of the Age of Kings campaigns, and I'm sure it's a contributing factor to the campaign's 2-sword rating. You are going to be in for quite a slugfest in this one. Old school players may remember that you could cheese the scenario by building a wonder on an island, but that sneaky Bassi covered the island in rocks to prevent you from doing that. Honestly, the scenario really does feel like an epic final showdown between the Saracens and Crusaders, and I have to give the Lion and the Demon a lot of credit for combining such an excellent experience with really strong gameplay. The cherry on top for this scenario is the inclusion of all of the memorable heroes. You once again command the Archers of the Eyes, I've already mentioned Richard's hero trebuchets, and you even get the ominously named Accursed Tower and the Tower of Flies to help defend Acre. Okay, so now that we have covered the scenarios of Saladin, we will continue our analytical routine by more broadly examining the campaign's strengths and weaknesses. As with all of the original campaigns, nostalgia is a big force here, but even so, I still think quite highly of Saladin. Starting as always with strengths, I have to say that Saladin's biggest selling point is its storytelling through gameplay. Even though you never control Saladin himself as a hero unit, the scenarios do a great job of having you play through the narrative of Saladin's rise to power and gradual expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land. You go from being challenged by rebels and pirates, to winning a decisive victory against the Crusaders in the open desert, to using that advantage to seize the biggest prize of the entire war in Jerusalem. Doing that puts the Crusaders on the defensive, which you can then play out by seeking out their citadels across the region. Lastly, once your victory appears complete, you are forced to endure one final test as the nations of Europe send in another wave of Crusader armies. It just feels like the actions you take in one scenario directly lead to the objectives of the next. This all may seem very obvious, but in my opinion, many campaigns feel like you're just teleporting from one battle to the next without getting that feeling of cohesion and causality. Relatedly, although the campaign's narrator does feel very Kingdom of Heaven, I think structuring the narrative of the Saracens from the perspective of a captured Crusader knight does a lot to help Western players better connect with Saladin's caliphate. Now, considering the gameplay, I think Saladin is kind of a mixed bag. Since we are still talking about the campaign's strengths, let's start with the good. In many ways, Saladin is a great example of simple, straightforward scenarios done well. None of the levels have all that many triggers, with Saladin 4 having the most at 30, but it rarely feels like the levels are empty in the same way it does for many of the levels of El Cid, at least in my opinion. I would give a lot of credit to the map design in this regard, as they tend to be on the larger side, with bases that really seem to strike a nice balance between being well defended and a horrible grind. All of the fun different hero units help with this as well. Finally, I do have to give a lot of credit to the in-game dialogue, as it's some of the most memorable in all of the campaigns. I've already mentioned the Crusaders attacking trade routes, but you also have shots from our bows rarely miss their mark. Avenge me, my brothers, for I cannot. If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And that's just to name a few. As memorable as the Saladin campaign is in so many ways, it also has some less than great aspects. Again, like most of the original campaigns, much of the gameplay does feel a bit dated, especially when it comes to Saladin 1. But even putting the first scenario aside, again, we run into the problem of many of the secondary enemies in the scenarios being complete pushovers. Some examples of that here would be Reynald's Raiders in Saladin 2, Jerusalem and the British in Saladin 3, and the Knight Orders in Saladin 4. Another thing that makes me just a little bit sad is how you're never given a pop limit of over 100. You could argue that it forces you to make better use of the Saracen market and their cost-efficient army, but I never really feel like I have the chance to get this massive army of Mamelukes, Cav Archers, monks, and siege and stuff like that. Perhaps in the latter half of the scenarios, the enemies could just be made a little bit stronger and you could be given a little bit of a higher pop limit, but again, this is just my opinion. Lastly, and this is somewhat related to the gameplay, I feel like although most of the scenarios are quite solid, very few of them jump out at me as super memorable. When I think of some of the best missions from the original game, I do think of Jihad and the Lion and the Demon, but that's really it. Yes, that is a third of the campaign, but it's also not quite as consistently good as some of the very top tier campaigns. I can't really say that this is a huge weakness of Saladin, but I also cannot say that it is one of its strengths. At last, the time has come for us to place Saladin on the tier list. I do indeed think of Saladin as a very strong campaign, but I just can't quite justify putting it in S tier, so A tier it will be. I'm sure some of you are shocked that I'm not putting all of the original campaigns in S tier, but I really am trying to be as objective as possible. Even so, Saladin is still really good, having solid gameplay, a memorable story, and excellent flavor. All of the great voice lines and hero units from this campaign did provide me with so many fond childhood memories, and they still make me smile to hear and see them today. However, the one thing that really holds it back from that top spot is just that, on a very basic level, I can't say that a majority of the scenarios from the campaign are super memorable. I would say that Saladin 5 and 6 certainly are, but the others are only a bit above average. For that reason, Saladin gets a very high A tier placement, but will just miss out on that top spot in S tier. The second campaign of the day brings us to South Asia in Prithviraj. Lasting from 1180 to 1192, our Indian campaign interestingly occurs simultaneously with the later events of Barbarossa and Saladin. Prithviraj was designed by Philadelphia and is considered part of the Forgotten campaigns. Like Alaric and Bari, this campaign has its origins in HD, but was more or less completely overhauled for DE. The HD version of Prithviraj did have some features that you could call typical for an AoE2 campaign, but it also had a ton of very long and buggy RPG sections, on top of only being 4 scenarios long. Therefore, although much of the subject matter is the same between the HD and DE versions of Prithviraj, the gameplay itself is a completely different experience. Regarding its difficulty, Prithviraj is actually going to be our second 2-sword difficulty campaign of the day. In my opinion, this campaign is pretty all over the place when it comes to difficulty and complexity, but I suppose that can average out to be considered a moderate rating. But let's see what's exactly going on in the scenarios of the Prithviraj campaign, shall we? The first level of the campaign is titled Born of Fire, which recounts our protagonist's beginnings as a young warrior prince that finds himself in a succession struggle. You start with Prithviraj himself and a few companions out on a hunt, but quickly realize that your 2 towns are under attack from your rival claimant to the Chauhan lands, Nagarjuna. You are told that you only have enough men to rescue one of the villages, but with some good micro you are actually able to save both town centers, and will be further rewarded with 1,000 extra food and gold if you're able to accomplish this. Once you get your economy, the mission actually becomes quite large in scale as you are able to get up to a full 200 pop post-imp Indians. To win, you have 2 choices. You can either assassinate Nagarjuna, or you can collect 3 relics that are randomly scattered around the land. Regardless of which path you choose, you must also contend with the warring Badanakas, Chandelas, and Paramaras. Lastly, there are a few Ghaznavid raiders camped to the far north that may guard a relic. Okay, so in true Philadelphia fashion, Born of Fire is quite the intro scenario to the Prithviraj campaign. In all honesty, I actually think that this is too much, as the very large scale of the mission leaves very little room to grow, if you know what I mean. It also feels like it should be swapped with the second level of the campaign, but I'll talk more about that shortly. Still, even if I have these more macro issues with the scenario, I do think that it plays out pretty well. I am always a fan of having lots of different factions, and it does give you a good sense of the competing interests between the various princes of Rajasthan. Lastly, I do think it's a nice touch to have the relics randomly generated each time, which gives the scenario a degree of replayability. Prithviraj's second scenario is the Digvijaya, which means conquest of all directions. Before he does any conquering, however, Prithviraj apparently has to go hunt a tiger. Indeed, you begin alone and cannot rejoin your companions until you have successfully hunted the tiger nearby. Afterwards, you will meet up with some of the other Chauhan soldiers, and then have to cut your way through the Naga priests to sail back to your capital of Ajmer. Once you arrive in town, you can begin your conquests, with your objectives being to kill your rival princes and to destroy the wonder of the Naga. Everyone begins in the feudal age, but you can again reach the imperial age with a pop limit of 200. Your main targets are the Rajas of Chalukya to the south, Sumra to the west, and Lahora to the north. Although not necessary to defeat, your main adversary will be Jayachandra to the east, who will aggressively pursue you with swordsmen and elephant archers. The main limiting factor here will be resources, so you really do need to expand everywhere to get the economy you need to defeat your rivals. So like I just said, the Digvijaya feels like it should be the campaign's first scenario. You begin all alone in the feudal age and end up fighting a bunch of enemies that are also in the feudal age. As far as the narrative goes, the ordering of the missions makes sense, but it does feel off from the perspective of gameplay progression. Regardless, the Digvijaya is a decent scenario in my opinion, as it does a really nice job of having you feel like you must conquer all directions to assert your dominance over the other Rajas. That said, I'm not a big fan of the whole hunting and Naga parts of the scenario, as they don't feel very relevant to the main focus of the scenario. Third in Prithviraj is Hand of a Princess, a small-scale A to B scenario where Prithviraj must sneak into the capital city of his arch-rival Jayachandra to whisk away his love Sanyogita. You begin with Prithviraj and a small group of raiders to the far west of the map, and have many different routes to get to Sanyogita in the far east. In general, there is a more head-on way where you have to fight through most of the map, and then there is the side route where you can use a siege onager to skip a good chunk of the enemy forces. Once you are reunited with Sanyogita, you must flee the city of Kanauj to get to the city of Lalkat in the far north. Again, there are a couple different routes to take, but no matter what, you're going to need to find a way to cross the various rivers and mountains to reach safety before the timer runs out. Hand of a Princess is quite a quick scenario and not all that difficult. I do like how there are quite a few different routes to take, and true to Philadelphia form, you do need to use your noggin to discover the best paths. There are many different nooks and crannies where you can find reinforcements, and it's a nice addition when it comes to creating engaging gameplay. I will say that the secondary objective of winning before the countdown reaches 550 years is a bit pointless since it's not an actual Steam achievement, and by design it has absolutely no impact on the scenario. However, that doesn't really negatively affect the mission itself. Beyond that, there's not really a whole lot to say about Hand of a Princess. It's a short A to B scenario that gives you a few interesting twists and turns. The climactic fourth scenario of Prithviraj is the appropriately titled The Fate of India, where our Chauhan Raja has his famous battle against the forces of Muhammad Ghori that are sweeping down from Afghanistan. Unfortunately for Prithviraj, the Ghurids have seized several holy relics, instantly starting a 200-year countdown. There are 3 relics in total, split amongst the 3 factions of Ghurids. You do not need to take the relics yourself, only ungarrison them from their respective monasteries. In addition, each time you ungarrison a relic, the 200-year countdown timer resets. All of that said, I have so far skimmed over one very important detail to this scenario. Both you and the Ghurids begin with full deathmatch resources. I'm not talking about the 8k food and gold you have in Attila 5, I'm talking full DM resources with 20k wood, 20k food, 10k gold, and 5k stone. This means you have to build up real quickly. The limiting factor here is that your villagers begin across a small river, so you need to transport them across before you can start slamming down tons of production buildings. Alrighty, so I have mixed feelings about the fate of India. On the one hand, it really is a challenging scenario that requires you to use some real deathmatch skills, otherwise you will totally be overrun since you're 3v1. The scope of this scenario also feels appropriately massive, as you are required to use everything Indians have at their disposal to deal with what will eventually become fully upgraded imp armies of Turks, Tatars, and Persians. On the other hand, this is another very short scenario, win or lose. Yes, this is a big epic battle, but it's over so quickly that I can't help but feel a little lacking when it comes to actually fighting the Ghurids. This feeling of being rushed also might be in part due to the fact that the Ghurids don't appear in any other Prithviraj scenario, but that's more of a macro issue that I'll get to later. Regardless, the fate of India is a pretty darn epic 10 minutes. In the campaign's finale, we go straight from climax to conclusion with The Legend of Prithviraj. Set away from Prithviraj's conflict with Muhammad Ghori, this mission actually brings us to the rest of India. So this scenario is actually quite complicated, but I will do my best to explain it briefly. Your basic objective is to convert the 4 Indian Rajas, each of whom control their own small kingdom, as well as defeating the Chola, Yadavas, and Pagan. The catch here is that you are immediately given the choice to convert one of those 4 Rajas, which will immediately turn over all of his units and buildings to you. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, but regardless of which you pick, you will only be given a few villagers and cannot build any town centers. This means that the only way to expand your economy is to convert the other Rajas, but even by doing that, you'll only gain another few villagers. This means that you have to be really cost efficient, as every unit will be incredibly difficult to replace. Nevertheless, you must strike out fairly quickly, as your enemies will eventually run you over with their superior production. There's a lot more nuance here that I could get into, but that gives you sort of the basic idea of what the scenario is about. With all of that said, what do I think of The Legend of Prithviraj? Truth be told, while I do think that it's really creative and gives you several different ways to play it, the scenario ultimately feels really slow and clunky, not to mention quite a jarring departure from the main narrative of the campaign. The fact that you have such a tiny eco pretty much equates to very slowly pushing with trebuchets and elephant archers. The scale of the scenario also feels so tiny compared to the previous mission, especially since it does technically cover an absolutely enormous area. I mean, if you look at the minimap, you can see that you are covering all of South Asia in the scenario. So yeah, I do unfortunately have to say that The Legend of Prithviraj feels kind of a gimmicky and unsatisfying way to end the campaign. Okay, so now that we've gone through the scenarios, it's time to cover the Prithviraj campaign's strengths and weaknesses. It has some very memorable aspects, but other moments just feel so clunky. In general, the core gameplay is fairly strong, the maps are nice, the enemy factions are diverse, and the basic narrative is quite compelling. It's just, again, it feels very clunky at times. Therefore, instead of the usual few minutes of outlining all of those aspects in detail, I'm going to be doing something a bit different. I'm going to go over how I personally would restructure the campaign in such a way that I think it would play out better and make more sense logically. Obviously, this is all just my opinion, and I'm not saying I know how to make campaigns better than Philadelphia, but still, this is what I would do. 1. First, we swap the first couple scenarios. Obviously, the story and specifics to the missions would need to be reworked a bit, but I think that this would be better in creating a more compelling story arc. Now that the Digvijaya is our first scenario, things make a lot more sense as we start all by ourselves in the feudal age, pursuing a tiger hunt without any concerns over our duties as a Raja. That way, we can keep the whole intro part of the scenario with the Naga, although I would give the player some more units and have them destroy the wonder then and there so you don't have to go back to it later in the scenario. The rest of the mission will play out quite similarly, although I would restrict the player to Castle Age and give them a pop limit of, say, 100. You really don't need any more for the scenario. Jayachandra could be swapped with Nagarjuna to make more sense as far as the story goes. 2. Born of Fire is now our second scenario, and all we need to do here is again swap Jayachandra with Nagarjuna. The fact that it's your main rival personally raiding your villages better sets him up as your archenemy. Jayachandra can't really die yet, so instead of that objective, it can just be replaced with destroying his wonder or castle or whatever. We can still start in Castle Age, but again, maybe restrict our max pop to 125 or something. I could go either way on letting the player reach Imperial Age. The rest of the scenario can play out as normal. 3. With Jayachandra better established as our enemy, Hand of a Princess will make a bit more sense as we just spent the last scenario getting raided by him and possibly destroying his castle. Again, the rest of the core gameplay can be pretty much the same. 4. Here's where things would take a bit of a different turn in my world. I would expand the campaign to 6 scenarios, as I just think that kind of works out better for AoE2 campaigns in general, and this is where I'd slot in that extra mission. As we are pushing the fate of India back a bit, we are now given an extra scenario to better establish the enmity between Prithviraj and Muhammad Ghori. Also, it gives Prithviraj more time to spend with Sanyogita, so she could appear here as well. Obviously, this scenario does not exist, so this is all hypothetical, but personally, I would make this a more straightforward build and destroy scenario, where we could finally reach the Imperial Age and maybe a pop limit of 150. Specifics aside, I would have this mission centered around protecting Chauhan lands from Gorid raids. Even though you obviously win, it makes it more believable that in the confusion, the Gorids were able to make off with some holy relics for the next scenario. 5. Now we go to the fate of India, which can be the big climactic battle between these two forces that was set up in the previous scenario. The real version of this level is really quite great, so we don't need to change the gameplay much, if at all. The only thing would possibly be to find a way for Prithviraj to be captured by the Gorids in the end. That's not too important, though. In the post-scenario narration, it is revealed that Prithviraj and Muhammad Ghori more or less kill each other, and Sanyogita pulls a Denethor. 6. With it being well established at this point that Prithviraj is dead, the final scenario can be a bit smoother in its goal of having Chandabar die, spread the tale of Prithviraj's heroic efforts to save India. This again just goes to my personal preference when it comes to scenario design, but I would rework this level a fair bit. To better connect your objectives to the Chauhan lands, I would make it so that you, no matter what, have a base in Rajasthan. Obviously the map would need to be expanded a bit. I do like the idea of the whole converting the other Rajas thing, so you could still do that at the start to give yourself a second base. If we really want to, we can keep the whole not needing to build villagers thing, but I would certainly increase the amount of eco you have as well as our pop limit no matter what. Then I would give our enemies economies as well. The rest of the scenario would play out quite similarly. So that's what I would do to change Prithviraj. Obviously, you can feel free to disagree with me, but I did try my best to keep the gameplay of most of the levels the same, while at the same time altering the pacing and the ordering to make a bit more sense. Well, with our workshop complete, we must now place Prithviraj as it exists now onto the tier list. This was a really hard one to place since the campaign has so many ups and downs, but I believe our Indian campaign still earns a spot in the B tier. Yes, much of the pacing and gameplay is a bit clunky, but Prithviraj is still pretty fun to play and has a great story. I haven't had the chance to talk about the story too much, but Prithviraj and Sanyogita have a very nice tragic love story, and all the characters are quite memorable. To me, this is what actually bumped the campaign up from C tier. Compared to El Cid, both have great storylines, and as awkward as Prithviraj can be at times, the gameplay is still, I think, a fair bit better. Regardless, this campaign was probably the toughest call to make so far, so definitely let me know what you think of Prithviraj in the comments.
A blue wolf took as his spouse a fallow doe. They settled at the head of the Onan River to raise their offspring, and there were born the Mongols.
That's right, the last campaign today will be Genghis Khan. It will go into the S tier. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time! Oh, wait, I actually need to review the campaign? I can't just put it in S tier? Well, alright. I certainly don't have any qualms with talking about my all-time favorite campaign. Genghis Khan is of course one of the original Age of Kings campaigns and is the showcase of the Mongol civilization. Bassi created the DE version of this campaign, but other than a few civilization swaps and adjustments and pop limit, it is very similar to the original. Also, fun fact, this is the only official campaign in all of DE where you play in the orange color. But regarding its difficulty, like all of the other non-Saladin AoK and AoC campaigns, Genghis Khan is considered a one-sword difficulty. I would say this is pretty accurate as most of the scenarios are pretty easy. And with that, it's time to journey to the steppe for our walkthrough of the Genghis Khan campaign's scenarios. First up is Crucible, a scenario very near and dear to my heart. If you don't know why, you'll find out soon. The mission begins with a very memorable cutscene where your small band of riders witnesses the horde of Genghis Khan pass by, followed by the man himself. You are tasked with seeking out the squabbling Mongol tribes and must convince as many as possible to join the horde. As the Great Khan departs, you are given a few light cav and cav archers, and then the original AoE2 RPG scenario begins in earnest. There are 6 tribes on the map, and to win, you must convince 4 of them to join you by completing various quests. To briefly go through them, the Ungurads are in the center of the map and will give you Mangudai if you bring a relic to their monastery. The Karyids are to the northwest and will give you monks and cav archers if you bring them 20 sheep. The Naiman and Taichuds each want you to destroy the other, so you can choose which one you want to join you. The Naiman are in the north and give you cav archers, and the Taichuds are to the southwest and give you light cav. The Uyghurs are to the far east of the map and will only join you if you can kill the great wolf Ornlu, whose packs have been attacking their flocks. If you manage to complete this nigh impossible task, they will give you camels and the chemistry technology. Finally, scattered throughout the map are the Karakitai, who will be hostile to you no matter what. Okay, so obviously Crucible has to get top marks for being the origin of Ornlu the Wolf, and indeed this is exactly where I got my online handle. Personal bias aside, this scenario is quite easy, but also very flavorful, as you do get the feeling of bringing together all of these small tribes to form something greater than the sum of its parts. All in all, a very fitting intro to the humble origins of the Mongols. The second Genghis Khan scenario has us complete our unification of the Mongol tribes in A Life of Revenge. At this point, most of the Mongols are under our sway, but the traitor Kushluk seeks to usurp Genghis Khan, already having recruited the Karakitai to his side. Your objective here is simple: kill Kushluk, and make sure that you defend the Great Tent of Genghis Khan, aka your wonder. You start with no eco, however, so you must go to the local Taichuds to persuade them to give you their base. After that, you will need to build up a bit, as this is one of the very few scenarios where you begin in the Dark Age. The camp of the Karakitai separate you from Kushluk, and they will be quite aggressive in attacking you with a fairly large army. However, once you get to Castle Age, it's pretty easy to build up a force to wipe out the Karakitai. As you approach him, Kushluk will run away to the far west of the map, so you will need to cut your way through his own large army to get to him. So, another fun fact, A Life of Revenge can theoretically be the shortest scenario of any that I will cover in this series, with its current speedrun record, as of recording, clocking in at 2 minutes 19 seconds game time from Mingudai Lee. So yeah, if I were to use that strategy myself, I actually wouldn't have enough background footage to complete this segment. That aside, A Life of Revenge is another very memorable, if not easy scenario. The in-game dialogue is great here, and the gameplay itself of hunting down Kushluk is quite fun. Still, like I said, after the first couple attacks of the Karakitai, there really isn't much stopping you from accomplishing your goal. Oh man, our next Genghis Khan scenario is the infamous Into China, and is another level that may be familiar to those of you who have seen my top 5 best designed scenarios video. This is a massive build and destroy scenario where you start with only a few horsemen in the feudal age and must defeat 4 enemy factions that will all eventually get to the imperial age. To get an economy, you must first capture some Chinese siege engineers that are located on your side of the Great Wall. There are plenty of resources for you to take in the north of the map, but you will need to build up quickly as the Chinese will not sit by idly. As mentioned, you have 4 enemies to defeat. Xixia controls the Great Wall itself, but their main base of operation is a cliff-top fortress to the southwest. The Tungats are the most aggressive enemy, and they operate out of rice fields in the center of the map. The Song are your weakest opponent, but they are also the furthest away, as their village is in the far southwest of the map. Finally, that leaves Jin, who is not only your strongest opponent, controlling an incredibly well-fortified city on an island to the east of the map, but they will also build a wonder. The only trump card you have comes in the form of 6 Gaia bombard cannons that you can find to the west of the map, just behind the Great Wall. Good luck! So yeah, this scenario did make it into my top 5 best designed scenarios list, so I obviously think Into China is a good one. It may seem very simple and straightforward, and that's because it is. This mission is just, in my opinion, the perfect example of your basic large-scale build and destroy scenario. You begin as mere petty raiders, have to steal Chinese know-how to build siege weapons and ships, and find a way to overcome enemies that are all technologically ahead of you. In DE, you command a 150 pop limit, going all the way from feudal age to the imperial age. The Jin Wonder is also built pretty quickly, and can certainly be a panic moment if you are not prepared. Of course, once you do come online, the scenario becomes a real power trip with Mangudai and Siege, and let's be real, that's awesome. Fourth up in Genghis Khan is The Horde Rides West, where the Mongols must wage a 2-front war against the Russians and the Khwarazm Persians. First and foremost, the Mongol forces begin divided, maintaining 2 small camps to the north and east of the map that are separated by impassable mountains. The northern camp is commanded by Genghis Khan's Chief General Subotai, who is tasked with defeating the Russians. They are an aggressive force early on, but can still be defeated rather easily. Also in this region can be found the Kipchaks, whose small camp can be swiftly taken over by Subotai's horde. The Persian Shah controls Samarkand, the Khwarazm capital, which dominates the southwest of the map. Now, the Persians are actually allied to you at the start, as the Shah is expecting the Mongols to send him gifts. Indeed, your eastern camp does contain 2 innocuous-looking trade carts that appear to serve that very purpose. However, it is revealed to you that instead of carrying lavish bribes, the trade carts instead contain assassins that must eliminate the Shah. You can choose when to send the carts to the Shah, but you must be careful. After 800 seconds game time, the Shah gets angry that he has not received his gift and will declare war on you anyway. If, for whatever reason, the Shah is alive when the Persians declare war, they will become a significantly more powerful opponent. Alrighty, so right away, the whole assassination aspect of the scenario is incredibly memorable and well executed, so to say. In addition to just being really cool, I appreciate how this whole interaction is more than just a cutscene, as there is actual decision making involved. You can try to delay the Shah's gift to give you more time to build up, but if you wait too long or try to sneak in an army, the Persians become far stronger. Beyond that, I like the split forces idea, as the large map size and low player count really do make you feel like you are traversing massive amounts of land in this scenario. However, I do have one complaint for the Horde Rides West, and that is the Russians. They are just such an underwhelming opponent, and I think it would make the scenario even better if they eventually became a powerful force in their own right, or could perhaps even ally with the Kipchaks. The 5th scenario in this campaign is The Promise. Many years have passed, and just as the Horde arrives in Europe, Genghis Khan dies, leaving the rule of the Mongols to his son Ogatai. Determined to carry on his father's legacy, your objective is to subjugate the Polish, Bohemians, and Germans. To win, you must capture a flag for each of these players, which can be accomplished by simply bringing a unit to the flags. In this incredibly mountainous map, you begin with a small camp to the northeast, the Polish can be found to the far east, the Germans to the south, and the Bohemians to the northwest. The Polish and Germans can be destroyed without too much difficulty, but the real issue lies with the Bohemians. Their army is absolutely massive, and to stand a chance in a fight against them, you must build 3 castles in the center of the map to form a defensive line. Once you do this, the Bohemians attack. However, if you manage to survive the onslaught, it is a relatively simple task to break into their fortress, capture their flag, and win the scenario. So I would say that I really do like the promise in some ways, but I have to admit that other parts feel a bit dated. Your start is somewhat slow in my opinion, and the Germans and Polish are just incredibly weak and easy to defeat with your swift Mangudai. The capture the flags concept is unique and interesting, and I appreciate that your enemies don't simply resign when you capture their flag. Like, you could run a quick unit into their base to complete your objective, but that doesn't actually do anything to make your enemies less of a threat. The defense of Wenceslaus's attack is very memorable, but I do think it's a bit lame that you can take all the time in the world to build your 3 castles. Again, I like the concept of the promise, but I do think that the implementation of your enemies could use some sprucing up. Last, but certainly not least, we have Pax Mongolica. If the name sounds off, the devs just adjusted it slightly in DE to be grammatically correct Latin. Anyway, this scenario is a final showdown between the Mongols and the Hungarians. In this very small battlefield, you begin on the northern bank of the Sajo River with a moderately sized camp. It's the middle of winter, so neither army can use ships to cross the semi-frozen river, meaning all fighting is over a single central bridge. Compared to your starting forces, the Hungarian side of the river is home to a massive amount of units and fortifications, giving them a head start. Yes, your goal is simply to defeat Hungary by destroying their castles and town centers, but this scenario does have some level of trickery going on beneath the ice. First, Subotai is on his way with reinforcements and will arrive after 40 minutes of game time with some saboteurs. The Hungarians have their own plans, however, and 5 minutes after Subotai shows up, they will blow up the Sajo River Bridge. To add insult to injury, they will also start to build a wonder. If at this point you don't have a foothold on the south bank of the Sajo River, the only way to get to the Hungarians is to cross the frozen water to the east of the map and cut your way through a dense forest. So yes, I know that Pax Mongolica is not the most difficult scenario in the world, as an experienced player can comfortably win before Subotai shows up. And kind of like the last scenario, I do think it's fair to say that your actual battle against the Hungarians is a bit dated. However, what I really appreciate about this scenario is that, yes, it's a straightforward 1v1 against Hungary, but it does have some twists and turns to keep it interesting. Pax Mongolica introduces saboteur hero units, Subotai's reinforcements, as well as the surprise with the whole bridge demolition and then wonder construction sequence. Finally, this is actually the only level in any of the campaigns that I cover in this series that only has 2 players. But in this case, I do think that it's fitting because it really is a 1v1 final battle, and the triggers do enough to keep it from being boring. Now that we've gone through the scenarios, for the last time today, we're going to cover the campaign's strengths and weaknesses. To be fair, I like to think that I'm a fairly thoughtful critic of AoE2 campaigns, otherwise I wouldn't be making this series, and in theory that would mean that there is a legitimate reason as to why this is my favorite campaign of all time. Anyway, let's talk about why I think this. Of course, starting with the strengths, I just think that Genghis Khan hits the mark in so many different areas. First and foremost, you really do feel the narrative of going from some petty nomadic raiders to becoming one of the largest empires in world history. This immersion comes through at different levels. Before you even start playing the campaign, the in-between scenario narration does such a great job of bringing you into the Mongol tribes. You really feel just how dismal life is in the steppe, and how through both ruthlessness and unity, the Mongols were able to tear apart their larger but fractured enemies. Then, looking at a micro level, the gameplay of the campaign does an excellent job of having you utilize speed and organization to overcome brute force. Even though you start in the most humble of beginnings, you learn through playing that well-controlled groups of cavalry and cav archers can decimate armies that may appear far more powerful. It also helps here that Mangudai are a good unit. But it's not just that. You get to test your Mongol armies against so many different types of enemies, ranging from small tribes to massive fortified cities. All of the fun flavor and immersion stuff aside, to me, the single biggest strength of Genghis Khan relative to other campaigns is its creation of memorable moments. I mean, literally each scenario has at least one moment that is likely to stick to you even years later. Yes, you can certainly argue that this is just my nostalgia at work, but I do think that this is not just limited to the old campaigns, as I think there are also moments in some of the new campaigns that are also quite memorable. But seriously, just offhand, Crucible, freaking Ornlu! Enough said. A life of revenge. Perhaps the inhabitants can be persuaded to join us. And run away! Run away! Into China. Jin's super fortified wonder being completed quite quickly, with the classic diss being hurled at you. What do a people who sleep in tents know of the word culture? The Horde rides west, the entire assassination sequence. What have the Mongols sent me? No doubt a bribe begging me not to destroy them. The Promise, the entire onslaught of the Bohemian army. Also the comic moment with the hermit monk who has been stuck on a mountain for 15 years despite clearly being able to see the exit right in front of him. Pax Mongolica, Subotai will be here in 40 minutes. And then, of course, the demolition of the Saja River Bridge. I mean, there are a lot of great campaigns in AoE2. We already have 3 in the S tier, and there are going to be many more to come. However, I don't think any other campaign brings you that many memorable moments throughout its entirety. But of course, fanboying aside, I do have to be honest with you guys and talk about Genghis Khan's weaknesses. Here, it's the same story as the other Age of Kings campaigns, dated gameplay and minimal difficulty. A lot of the enemies fall apart rather easily, especially since DE generally gives you a higher population limit. The Kharkitai, Russians, Polish, Hungarians all feel like their AI design could be a bit more elegant. Just to be clear, I'm not criticizing the map design or the way that the bases look or even some of the mechanics. I'm just specifically addressing the AIs themselves and how I wish that fighting them would feel a bit more dynamic and challenging. Okay, now for realsies, it's time to place Genghis Khan on the tier list. I really did try to be as objective as I could when writing the script for this segment, but of course, at the end of the day, the Great Khan will comfortably join the S tier. Like I said, this is my favorite campaign for a reason. The scenarios have a ton of variety in terms of location and enemies you face, the story is awesome, albeit in a rather macabre way, and has such awesome gameplay where you can rack up insane KD ratios with your Mangudai. Lastly, the campaign brought to life Ornlu the Wolf, and that is just a character that I will always have a close personal connection to. It doesn't matter if I'm 7 years old, or 15, or 23, I just love this campaign. And with that, we are almost at the halfway point for the series, with 12 campaigns completed. Another very strong day today, with one campaign for each of the top 3 tiers. I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but I'll still ask that you let me know in the comments what you think of Saladin, Prithviraj, and Genghis Khan. I actually checked my analytics for my YouTube channel recently, and I saw that around 80% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed, so be sure to do that if you want to see a ton more content for both AoE2 single player and multiplayer. But that's going to be it for this nostalgia-filled episode. Tune in next time when we cover Kotian Khan, Sunjata, and Edward Longshanks. Wow, that's going to be quite the mix of campaigns. Lastly, as always, thank you all so much for watching and supporting these videos, and I'll see you all next time.